During the Second World War, President Roosevelt's stature was even enhanced because of his remarkable war leadership. He was certainly the most influential figure to ever uh, represent the United States in world politics. And American power by the end of World War II was the strongest the world had ever seen. In this sense, the only ideological manifestations one might see from Roosevelt were that his objectives after the war, after the defeat of fascism completely in Japan, Germany, and Italy, was a foreign policy based upon the United Nations and upon a philosophy of anti-colonialism, which put him at odds with his allies in Britain and France. But Roosevelt also was committed to trying to work with the Soviet Union. And perhaps that is the leading issue which separates different parts of the Democratic Party and certainly the Democrats from Republicans. Within the Democratic Party, one faction crystallized around Roosevelt's vice president, a man from the Midwest, Henry Wallace, been a wealthy farmer, who'd been an agronomist, and who was very liberal. Roosevelt selected him to be vice president in 1940, and his liberalism increasingly put off mainstream Democrats who were concerned that were Roosevelt's health to continue deteriorating as much as his appearance appeared to suggest, then Henry Wallace might be president. And they did what they could to force Roosevelt to remove Wallace from the ticket. In 1944, Wallace was dumped from the Democratic ticket, with Harry Truman, a centrist Democrat who had supported the New Deal from Missouri, becoming vice president, a person with whom Roosevelt had very little relationship. Indeed, they spent hardly any time together, and Truman did not even know of the atomic bomb project until after he became president of the United States. And then there were conservative Democrats who were largely supportive of the president during the war, but who were increasingly concerned about anti-communism and especially about the prospect of a strong civil rights policy after World War II. When Roosevelt died in April of 1945, the United States and the Democratic Party certainly lost a giant. The vacuum that Roosevelt left politically was difficult for anyone to fill, let alone Truman, who was widely viewed as a person without great substance. That was an inaccurate perception because Truman showed there was a great deal more to him than people might have thought. In the area of foreign policy, Truman pursued a somewhat confrontational, but careful confrontational policy toward the Soviet Union. He was certainly anti-communist, but he was careful. When the Soviets, for instance, in 1948 sought to blockaded Berlin, Truman pursued a policy of airlift of supplies to West Berlin rather than trying to confront the Soviets militarily. That airlift worked. It was one of the great successes of American foreign policy history. By 1946 and 1947, Truman had become convinced there was no working with the Soviets. As a consequence of that, he advocated policies that became known as the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, all of which fell under the general rubric of a policy called containment, which had been articulated by a professional diplomat named George F. Kennan. The thesis of that policy was that the Soviet Union was irreconcilable diplomatically at this time, and therefore the United States needed to prevent the Soviets from advancing, containing Soviet advances, although it did not call for confrontation with the Soviet Union. Generally, mainstream Republicans also accepted that position. In the area of civil rights, Truman was pressed more and more by liberals, and finally in 1948 he took two steps which were dramatic and important, one of which was to desegregate the armed forces simply by executive order because Truman, after all, was commander-in-chief of the Army, and the second one was to support a strong pro-civil rights platform for the Democratic Party which caused the South, led by Strom Thurmond, to simply walk out of the party, creating a new party for that year at least, called the States' Rights Party, or more familiarly known as the Dixiecrats. Former supporters of Henry Wallace also rallied against Truman in 1948, believing that it was his hardline policies that were responsible for the Cold War, and they formed a political party called the Progressives, led by Henry Wallace. So Truman was confronted with two third-party movements from the Democratic Party, within the Democratic Party, one on the far left, called the Progressives, one on the far right, the States' Rights or Dixiecrat Party, and in spite of that, Truman was able to win this remarkable victory in 1948. And by then, Truman was certainly identified as being a New Dealer. His policy he presented was called the Fair Deal, but it really wasn't a great deal different than the New Deal, although Truman now had to confront the reality of a Congress that was Republican, having been elected in 1946. By 1952, because of the Korean War and certain scandals in the Truman administration, although Truman himself was never personally tarred with any suggestion of scandal, it was clear that Truman could not be renominated. And the Democrats selected a liberal mainstreamer named Adlai Stevenson, former governor of Illinois. And remarkably, Stevenson selected as his vice president a Southern Democrat named John Sparkman, a senator from Alabama, in an effort to rebuild the Democratic Party in the South. The effort succeeded in regard to rebuilding the party in the South, but Stevenson was decisively defeated twice by Dwight Eisenhower in 1952 and 1956, when he was once again the candidate of the party. And by 1960, we have a new Democratic Party emerging, a party in which John Kennedy, this remarkable figure, certainly one of the most important figures in modern American political history because of the style he brought to campaigning and the great skill he presented with television, emerges as a leading candidate for the 1960 party. Kennedy is clearly an L or an SL, liberal or somewhat liberal. He is not committed to all the policies of the New Deal, but he nonetheless is willing to commit himself to advancing health care and other such issues, generally strongly pro-labor. He's challenged on the left by Hubert Humphrey, who does indeed follow the Americans for Democratic Action policies of the 1944 State of the Union address and is extremely strong on civil rights. And on the right, Lyndon Johnson, who is not a conservative, but runs as a pragmatic senator from Texas who has sympathy for the South. As we know, Kennedy selects Johnson to be his vice president, and Johnson and Kennedy are elected in 1960. The mainstream of the Democratic Party remains in the LSL sector. During this period, Kennedy is confronted by Southern senators and members of the House who resist legislation on civil rights. Kennedy continues involvement in Southeast Asia, beginning a very significant one in Vietnam, although there had been several hundred American advisors there previously under the Eisenhower administration. And Kennedy generally pursues a very activist foreign policy. Certainly his most famous moment is during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy confronts the Soviets and forces them to back down from keeping their missiles in Cuba. Enables them to get them out. One of the most shocking events of American history was the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, made even more shocking by the fact that this was all televised now, from the tragedy, not the assassination, of course, but everything else was on television. 4 days of funeral, 4 days of grief over Kennedy, and the emergence of a new president, Lyndon Johnson. Johnson becomes one of the most remarkable figures in the history of the Democratic Party because this somewhat conservative senator is responsible for pushing the most extensive civil rights legislation this country's ever seen. and embodied in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and at the same time pursues a war on poverty and policy known as the Great Society, which expands government tremendously. Johnson, who began his career as an SC, now might appropriately be seen as an L, or as a liberal or very liberal figure in American politics. However, the Vietnam War causes the emergence of an anti-war movement in the Democratic Party. By 1965 and 1966, it due in no small part to the fact that there's a military draft, which causes people your age to be subject to being called to active service and going to war in Vietnam. Unlike today, where we have a volunteer army, and most of the volunteers join the service for economic reasons or because they have a sense of adventure. At that time, there were many, many students and others who did not want to be in Vietnam, but were drafted. And the whole sense of a resistance to the draft, of a counterculture that is emerging, of a drug culture that is emerging, of violence, causes the Democratic Party to begin to come apart in 1968. We have first a challenge to President Johnson's re-election campaign in 1968, led by Senator Eugene McCarthy. That's not Joseph McCarthy. Eugene McCarthy of Wisconsin, who comes close to beating Johnson, shocking Johnson, to the point where this very, very thin-skinned man, not a good trait for a politician to have, decides he's not going to run for renomination. Then Robert Kennedy, the brother of the late president, of the martyred president now, enters the nomination campaign. And Robert Kennedy is killed the night of his victory in the California primary on June 5th, 1968. And finally, we have George McGovern, a liberal senator from South Dakota, emerges as the last force in the VL part of the party to challenge Hubert Humphrey for the Democratic nomination. Humphrey has not entered one primary, but because the system has changed and how we nominate president, at that time was still under the process of being dominated by caucuses, as well as the primaries playing a role, the party professionals see that Humphrey gets the nomination, although there are riots at the convention and a great sense of loss by the Democrats, by younger Democrats especially. The years between 1968 and 1972 are the years of greatest turmoil for the Democratic Party. During these years, the VLs, the young people, especially in the anti-war movement, clash with the Ls and SLs, the liberals and somewhat liberals. George McGovern, the liberal that I mentioned earlier, now becomes the standard bearer for the very liberal part of the party, and in 1972, at a contentious nomination, is nominated. With McGovern's nomination, a significant part of the party either repudiates McGovern or even leaves the party. And during this convention, we have the beginnings of what some might call the neoconservative movement. That is, people who had formerly been Democrats who had now moved over to the Republican Party. Democrats lose badly in 1972. In 1976, Jimmy Carter, who comes a Southerner, the first non-segregationist Southerner, who comes to prominence in the Democratic Party, becomes president, largely because of the repudiation of Nixon at Watergate. Carter is a born-again Christian, wears his religion on his sleeve, says he wants to bring morality back to American politics, and wins barely against Gerald Ford, a very uninspiring candidate. Carter's presidency is an unremarkable one. He's not a failed president, as many suggest, but he's certainly not a very successful president. And at the end, his presidency is badly tarnished by the seizure of American diplomats at our embassy, the American embassy in Tehran, and the fact that they remain hostages for over a year. This, coupled with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, causes Carter to appear to be weak in foreign policy, and the Democrats, who have very little choice but to renominate him, are confronted with a difficult situation. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan, a conservative Republican, becomes the nominee, while there's a sense that this might be an easy person to beat, Reagan's performance in debates and Carter's unpopularity results in a huge victory for President Reagan in 1980. And with that, the Democrats go through a period of wondering where they are. The VLs in the party remain a force, but it is clear that one of them can no longer be renominated, although one of the forces in the VLs is a African-American young minister named Jesse Jackson, who is the first black to run seriously for the presidency, and he gathers around him a number of very liberal persons in the party, but he has no real chance of a nomination. The nomination goes to two liberals, 1984, Walter Mondale, who had been the vice president under Carter, and Michael Dukakis, a former governor of Massachusetts, in 1988. Both of these men are liberals. They are mainstreamers, and both are defeated badly by their Republican opponents. So the Democrats go through a process of trying to figure out where it went wrong. They move somewhat to the right, and in 1992, a Southerner who had been a liberal, certainly, and who retains many liberal ideals, nonetheless believing that the party needs to move more to the center, Bill Clinton, is elected. Clinton's first few years are featured by his attempting to pass a program of health care. Ironically, that's the same kind of program that we've had to address recently and that Obama had committed himself to. He's not able to succeed. Republicans win by huge numbers in 1994 in both houses of Congress, and Clinton decides, as a pragmatist, the only thing he can do is tack over to the right, move to the right. And so the Democratic Party's weight becomes liberal to somewhat conservative, to only somewhat liberal by that time, and Clinton transformed himself. We know that Clinton had personal issues, as the affair that he had with a young intern named Monica Lewinsky, which caused his impeachment. But he seemed to be able to revive himself after that event, when he was able to defeat an effort to remove him as president. And by the end of the decade, by the end of the century, in 2000, with the support of his vice president Al Gore, it appears that the Democratic Party is solidly in the L to SL sector. Gore loses in a very contentious election. There isn't a serious struggle for nomination in the 2000 process. In 2004, the Democrats select a liberal to SL named John Kerry, who had been a war hero during the Vietnam War, but a war hero who had emerged against the war, who was part of the anti-war movement. Kerry runs and is defeated by George W. Bush. The Democrats again think in terms of staying within the L to SL range. In 2008, the candidates, as you know, are Hillary Clinton, a mainstream liberal with a tinge of SL to her, Obama, who identifies himself as a mainstream liberal, and John Edwards, who comes somewhat more from the left. Obama is elected, and I think with his election, we see where the Democratic Party is. It's a mainstream party at this time, mainstream liberal party, and Obama's re-election only reinforces that. That'll do it for the Democrats for now. We'll move on to the Republicans later.